1822, a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion sat down with a piece of basalt and cracked a code that had been silent for 1400 years. What he unlocked was not just a writing system, it was 3,000 years of conversations with gods. Everything we know about this episode, every name, every myth, every careful theological argument about the nature of creation, was lost. Completely. For longer than Christianity has existed, the priests who knew these things died. The temples were stripped. The language itself was forgotten. And then, improbably, it came back. This is the final episode, and we meet the gods that the Egyptians considered the most powerful of all. Not the dramatic ones, not the gods of war and chaos and resurrection we've already covered, but the ones who built everything. The God who created the world not with his hands, not with his body, but by thinking of it, and then saying it out loud. The God so hidden, so fundamentally invisible, that his own theological texts admit, without embarrassment, that no other God has ever seen his true face. He was present in everything and visible in nothing. And then one pharaoh decided that all of this, 3,000 years of accumulated divine architecture, was wrong. One man, 17 years, and he came extraordinarily close to making it stick. We also go where every Egyptian was eventually going regardless. The full machinery of what happens after you die. The 42 judges. The scale. The feather. The heart. The field on the other side where the grain grows without drought and the water runs without flood. The Egyptians spent 3,000 years building a door they believed they could walk through. This is what was on the other side. Ptah. Egyptian Ptah, a name whose etymology is uncertain, with proposed connections to roots meaning to open, to carve, or to create, was the supreme deity of Memphis, the ancient capital of Lower Egypt, situated at the apex of the Nile Delta, near the modern southern suburbs of Cairo. His cult at Memphis is attested from the early dynastic period, the first and second dynasties, approximately 3,100 to 2686 BCE, and endured without significant interruption through the Roman period. For much of pharaonic history, Memphis functioned as the administrative capital of Egypt, even when political power was centered elsewhere, and Ptah's prominence within the state religious system reflected this administrative centrality as much as any purely theological development. Ptah's iconography is among the most distinctive and visually arresting in the Egyptian pantheon, and also among the most deliberately constructed. He is depicted as a tightly mummiform figure, wrapped in a close-fitting garment that leaves only his hands free, standing upright on a plinth, holding a composite scepter that combines three of the most symbolically loaded objects in Egyptian religious vocabulary: the Was scepter of divine power, the Jed pillar of stability and endurance, and the Ankh of life. His head is shaved or covered by a close-fitting skullcap. He wears a broad collar. A Menet necklace associated with Hathor and with musical and generative power hangs at his back. His skin is typically rendered in blue, the color of the sky, of the primordial waters, and of divine creative potential in Egyptian symbolic thought. The mummiform posture of Ptah is theologically significant and has generated considerable scholarly discussion. Unlike the mummiform Osiris, whose wrapped body encodes death, preservation, and the hope of resurrection, Ptah's wrappings do not represent death. They represent concentrated, contained power. The force of creation held within a deliberately constrained form, like pressure within a vessel. Ptah does not move because he does not need to move. Creation proceeds from him without physical effort, through the power of thought and speech alone. His stillness is not inertia, but control. The theological system centered on Ptah, known to Egyptologists as the Memphite theology, represents one of the most philosophically sophisticated bodies of religious thought to survive from the ancient world, and its primary document is among the most extraordinary texts in the entire Egyptian corpus. The Shabaka stone, a large basalt slab now in the British Museum, EA 498, carved on the order of the 25th dynasty, Pharaoh Shabaka, around 710 BCE, preserves a text that its own inscription claims to be a copy of an older, worm-eaten papyrus. The text had previously been dismissed as a Ramesside or even later composition, but more recent scholarship, particularly the work of John Baines and of Frank Camazel, has identified linguistic features consistent with Old Kingdom origin, suggesting that the theological ideas it encodes may genuinely reach back to the period of pyramid construction, or earlier. The Memphite theology's central claim is that Ptah created the world not through physical action, not through the manual crafting on a potter's wheel that characterizes Noom's creation, not through the sexual self-generation of a tomb, but through thought and speech. The text describes creation as a two-stage process. First, Ptah conceived of each thing in his heart, the EEB, understood in Egyptian thought as the organ of consciousness and intention. And then he named each thing with his tongue, and in the naming, the thing came into existence. Thought was the creative intention. Speech was its actualization. The world was, in this theology, a spoken world, the material expression of divine language. This formulation has attracted considerable attention from scholars of comparative religion and philosophy because it anticipates by many centuries ideas that would become central to Greek Stoic philosophy, specifically the concept of the Logos, the divine rational principle that ordered and sustained the cosmos, and that would later appear in the opening of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The intellectual historian Jan Assmann, in his influential work Moses the Egyptian, 1997, and related studies, has traced the complex transmission pathways through which Egyptian theological concepts, including the Memphite logocentric creation theology, may have influenced later Greek and ultimately early Christian thought. The connections are not direct borrowings but structural homologies, similar answers to similar questions, produced by different traditions operating in proximity over many centuries. The Shabaka stone text goes further than simply asserting that Ptah spoke the world into existence. It explicitly identifies Ptah with Atum, the Heliopolitan creator, and argues that what Atum accomplished through physical generation, Ptah had already accomplished through thought and speech. Atum's creative acts were, in this reading, the physical enactment of Ptah's prior mental creation. The theology is not merely asserting Ptah's priority, it is proposing a model of creation in which the mental and the physical are related as original and copy, with Ptah's thought being the true creation, and a tomb's physical acts being its material expression. This is a genuinely philosophical argument about the relationship between mind and matter, articulated in a religious context roughly 2.5 millennia before Plato. Alongside his profound theological identity as the logocentric creator, Ptah maintained throughout Egyptian history a robust practical identity as the divine patron of craftsmen, architects, and all those who made things with skill and intention. This combination, supreme abstract creator and patron of manual craft, is not contradictory within Egyptian thought, where the distinction between intellectual creation and physical making was not categorical. Ptah created through language, craftsmen created through skill. Both were participating in the same fundamental divine activity of bringing new form into existence from available material. The title, Great of Craftsmanship, were Karep Hemut, was one of Ptah's standard epithets, and it was also applied to the chief craftsmen attached to major temple workshops and to the skilled artisans of the royal court. The connection was explicit. To be a great craftsman was to be doing what Ptah did, and to do it excellently was to honor him. This theological framing of manual skill as divine participation gave Egyptian craft traditions a religious gravity that is reflected in the extraordinary quality of surviving Egyptian material culture. The precision of stone carving, the refinement of jewelry and metalwork, the technical sophistication of faience production, which consistently exceeds what purely economic incentives would have produced. The workers of Deir el-Medina, the village of royal tomb craftsmen on the west bank of Thebes, inhabited throughout the New Kingdom period and documented through an extraordinary archive of administrative records, legal texts, letters, and literary compositions recovered from the site, worshipped Ptah as one of their primary patrons alongside Hathor and the deified Amenhotep I. The Deir el-Medina archive, now distributed between the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo, the British Museum, the Turin Egyptian Museum, and other collections, represents one of the most complete pictures of daily life in any ancient community, and Ptah's presence in it as the divine patron invoked in personal prayers, commemorated in household shrines, and appealed to in legal oaths, demonstrates the genuinely lived quality of his cult among working people, not merely its official theological elaboration. Ptah's syncretism with Sokar, the ancient Memphite god of the Necropolis, one of the oldest funerary deities in the Egyptian Pantheon, attested from the early dynastic period, produced the compound deity Ptah Sokar, and the subsequent further merger with Osiris produced the triple compound Ptah Sokar Osiris, one of the most theologically loaded divine identities in late Egyptian religion. This triple syncretism was not a random accretion of similar deities, but a deliberate theological statement. It combined Ptah's creative power, Sokar's mortuary guardianship, and Osiris's resurrection theology into a single figure who embodied the complete cycle from creation through death to renewed existence. Ptah Sokar, Osiris figures, composite mummiform statuettes that are one of the most common types of Egyptian funerary object recovered from New Kingdom and later tombs, were placed in tombs as divine presences that guaranteed the deceased's passage through death and their ultimate resurrection. These figures are hollow in many cases, They contained rolled papyrus scrolls inscribed with Book of the Dead spells, making them simultaneously divine images and libraries of protective texts. The British Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo each hold hundreds of examples spanning a range of quality and material, from rough painted wood to finely modeled gilded hardwood, reflecting the broad social spectrum of Egyptians who desired this divine presence at their burial. We have already encountered Amun twice in this series. In episode 1, as one of the 8 primordial abstractions of the Hermopolitan Ogdohad, representing the hidden and invisible quality of the pre-creation void. And in episode 1, again as the solar deity with whom Ra was syncretized to produce the new kingdom's supreme god, Amun-Ra. Tonight, we examine Amun in his full historical development, from local deity to king of gods, from abstract primordial force to the theological near equivalent of a universal creator, from the specific cult of Thebes to a religious institution of extraordinary wealth and political power. Amun's origins as a local Theban deity are attested from the 11th dynasty, approximately 2055 BCE, when the Theban princes who had found the Middle Kingdom first elevated their local god to state prominence. But Amun's inclusion in the Ogdohad at Hermopolis suggests that some form of his cult may predate this political rise, that the name and concept of the Hidden One existed in Egyptian theological vocabulary before the political fortunes of Thebes made him a major national deity. The precise relationship between the Ogdohad's Amun and the Theban Amun is not fully resolved in Egyptological scholarship, with some researchers treating them as parallel developments and others arguing for direct continuity. Amun's name, from the Egyptian Amun, meaning hidden or concealed, captures his most fundamental theological characteristic. He was the god whose nature could not be perceived directly, the divine presence that animated everything while remaining invisible within it. A New Kingdom, theological text preserved at Leiden, Papyrus Leiden 1350, describes Amun in terms that approach the philosophical sublime. He is hidden from the gods, and his aspect is unknown. He is farther than the sky. He is deeper than the Dut. No god knows his true form. His image is not displayed in the writings. No one bears witness to him. This is not the modest claim of a small cult. It is a theological maximalism that positions Amun beyond the entire conceptual apparatus of Egyptian religion, beyond the other gods, beyond the written tradition, beyond the reach of any image or name. The New Kingdom, the period from approximately 1550 to 1069 BCE, encompassing the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, was the period of Egypt's greatest imperial power, and the rise of Amun to supreme divine status was inseparable from that political expansion. When the Theban prince Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos, the Semitic-speaking rulers who had controlled northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, and reunified the country around 1550 BCE, founding the 18th dynasty, he did so in Amun's name and attributed his military success to Amun's divine support. The gratitude expressed in royal inscriptions was matched by material donations on a scale that would eventually make Amun's temple at Karnak the wealthiest religious institution in the ancient world. The Karnak temple complex, ancient Epet-e-Sut, the most select of places, is the largest religious building ever constructed, covering approximately 2 square kilometers and incorporating the accumulated building programs of 30 successive pharaohs over more than 1,000 years. Its great hypostyle hall, built primarily under Seti I and Ramesses II, approximately 1290 to 1255 BCE, contains 134 columns arranged in 16 rows, the central 2 rows rising to approximately 23 meters in height and nearly 4 meters in diameter. The columns are covered with carved and painted relief decoration from kis to capital. Standing in the hypostyle hall, which visitors to Luxor can still do today, produces a specific physical experience that ancient sources describe in terms of awe and disorientation. The scale exceeds what the human visual system is calibrated to process in a single glance. The economic power of the Karnak institution grew in proportion to the political success of the New Kingdom pharaohs, who donated agricultural land, mining revenues, trade goods, and foreign tribute to Amun's treasury, in quantities documented in administrative papyri and temple inscriptions. The Harris Papyrus, British Museum EA 9999, dated to the reign of Ramesses IV, approximately 1153 BCE, is the most extensive surviving economic document from ancient Egypt, a massive papyrus roll over 40 meters in length that records the total donations made to Egyptian temples during the reign of Ramesses III. The figures for Amun's Karnak temple are extraordinary. Tens of thousands of workers attached to the temple estates, hundreds of thousands of cattle, enormous tracts of agricultural land in Egypt, Nubia, and the Levant. By the end of the New Kingdom, the temple of Amun at Karnak controlled approximately 30% of all agricultural land in Egypt, a concentration of institutional wealth that would eventually produce the political crisis known as the Third Intermediate Period. The syncretism of Amun with Ra, the merger of the hidden, immanent, universal deity with the visible, active solar creator, produced a theological compound that was more than the sum of its parts. Amun-Ra was not simply Ra with Amun's name added, or Amun with Ra's solar attributes. The merger produced a new theological formulation, a deity who was simultaneously the visible sun in the sky and the invisible animating presence within all things, the specific and the universal, the manifest and the hidden. This combination addressed a theological problem that pure solar monotheism could not solve. If the sun is everything, what accounts for the things that the sun does not illuminate? The depths of the earth, the interior of living beings, the hidden causes of events. Amun, as the hidden principle, filled precisely this gap. He was present where Ra was not, in the darkness of the womb where new life formed, in the earth where seeds germinated, in the reasoning mind that reached conclusions the senses could not provide. Amun-Ra was therefore a theology of complete divine presence, visible and invisible, solar and subterranean, external and internal. The New Kingdom hymns to Amun-Ra, preserved in multiple papyri, including the already mentioned Leiden Papyrus, 1-350, and the papyrus Bulaq 17, Cairo Egyptian Museum, 18th Dynasty, articulate this theology with remarkable philosophical consistency and poetic beauty. The great hymn to Amun in Papyrus Leiden, 1-350, studied in detail by Jan Assmann, whose 1995 monograph, Egyptian Solar Theology in the New Kingdom, remains the standard modern treatment, describes Amun-Ra as a Trinitarian deity. All gods are three, Amun, Ra, and Ptah. There is no second to them. Hidden is his name as Amun. He is Ra in face, and his body is Ptah. This is a striking formulation. The three great creator gods of Egypt, the hidden deity of Thebes, the solar deity of Heliopolis, and the craftsman deity of Memphis, are here presented not as three separate beings, but as three aspects of a single divine identity. Amun is the hidden name, the unknowable inner nature. Ra is the visible face, the outward manifestation. Ptah is the body, the material creation. Together, they constitute completeness. The unknowable, the knowable, and the known. Egyptologist Eric Hornung, in his foundational study, Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt, The One and the Many, English translation 1982, identified this kind of New Kingdom theological synthesis as a form of implicit monotheism, a tendency within Egyptian polytheism to understand the multiplicity of gods as multiple expressions of a single underlying divine reality, without fully articulating or institutionalizing this tendency as a formal doctrine. The tendency was real and detectable across a range of New Kingdom texts, but it coexisted with robust polytheistic practice and never produced, within the mainstream tradition, the categorical exclusion of other gods that characterizes strict monotheism. That development, the institutional enforcement of divine singularity, required a different kind of intervention. The religious revolution associated with the Pharaoh Akhenaten, born Amenhotep IV, reigning approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, son of Amenhotep III, whose Sekhmet statues we discussed in episode 4, is the most extensively studied episode in Egyptian religious history, and one of the most debated in the history of religion generally. Its importance lies not only in what it was, but in what it has been claimed to be. The world's first monotheism, the source of later Abrahamic religious ideas, the product of one man's mystical insight, or alternatively, the calculated political maneuver of a pharaoh attempting to break the institutional power of the Amun priesthood. All of these interpretations contain elements of truth, and none is entirely adequate. The Aten, the solar disk, Aten in Egyptian, had been a religious concept long before Akhenaten. The disk of the sun as a divine entity, distinct from Ra who travelled in it, appears in Egyptian texts from the Middle Kingdom period and receives increasing theological attention during the early 18th dynasty. Thutmose IV reigned approximately 1400 to 1390. BCE used the term Aten in royal inscriptions, with what appears to be particular reverence. Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, included the term in the name of his royal pleasure barge. The theological elaboration of the Aten as a divine entity was therefore a gradual development within the existing solar tradition, not an unprecedented invention by Akhenaten. What Akhenaten did was take this development to its logical and institutional extreme. In approximately the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, effective spirit of the Aten, and began the program that would transform Egyptian religion for the duration of his reign. He founded a new capital city, built on virgin ground at the site now called Amarna, ancient Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt, approximately halfway between Memphis and Thebes. The site was chosen according to the boundary stele that Akhenaten erected around its perimeter, because it belonged to no previous deity. It was clean ground, unclaimed by the established religious geography of Egypt, and could therefore be wholly dedicated to the Aten. The religious program at Akhenaten was distinctive in both its content and its form. Aten temples were open-air structures without roofs. The sun needed to be visible, present, physically shining on the ritual, in contrast to the dark, enclosed inner sanctums of conventional Egyptian temples, where divine statues were housed in near total darkness. Offerings were laid on altar tables in the open courtyard, under the direct light of the disk. There were no divine statues. The Aten was not depicted as an anthropomorphic deity, but as the disk itself, from which descending rays terminated in human hands holding their ankh of life. The image was abstract, schematic, deliberately unlike the rich zoomorphic and anthropomorphic divine iconography of the rest of the Egyptian tradition. The theological content of Atenism, as recoverable from the hymns and inscriptions of the Amarna period, was a genuine and developed solar theology. The great hymn to the Aten, preserved most completely in the tomb of at Amarna, tomb At-25, studied extensively by the Egyptologist William Murnane, and sometimes compared for its literary quality and theological content to the Hebrew Psalm 104, describes the Aten as the sole creator and sustainer of all life, present in every living creature, governing the cycles of day and night, the flooding of the Nile, the growth of all plants, the breath of every animal. The Aten does not merely illuminate the world. The Aten is the condition under which any life is possible. The exclusivity of Atenism, its suppression of all other cults, was systematically enforced. Agents of Akhenaten's administration traveled through Egypt, erasing the names of other gods from temple walls, particularly the name of Amun, which appeared in the most prominent and accessible locations in every major religious complex. The plural word gods was itself targeted. Inscriptions were altered to remove the grammatical plural, reflecting the theological insistence that divinity was singular. The Karnak complex was partially dismantled. Its talatat blocks, the small standardized sandstone blocks used in Akhenaten's own building programs, were later reused as fill-in subsequent construction projects and have been recovered in their thousands by archaeologists, providing an extraordinary record of Amarna period art and architecture in fragmentary form. The question of whether Atenism constitutes the world's first monotheism, or whether it should be categorized differently, as solar henotheism or as a form of pharaonic solipsism, in which the only legitimate religious relationship was between the Aten and Akhenaten himself, with ordinary Egyptians worshipping Akhenaten rather than the Aten directly, remains debated. The historian Donald Redford, in his major study Akhenaten, The Heretic King, 1984, argued for a political rather than a primarily spiritual interpretation of the Atenist program. The Egyptologist James Allen has offered a more theologically sympathetic reading. Jan Assmann's Moses the Egyptian and its sequel The Price of Monotheism, 2004, placed the Akhenaten episode within a broader argument about the psychological and cultural consequences of monotheistic exclusivity, the mosaic distinction between true and false religion, that generated considerable scholarly and public debate. Akhenaten died in approximately 1336 BCE after a reign of 17 years. The precise circumstances of his death are unknown. His immediate successors, the short-reigned Smenkhare, then the child Pharaoh Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, then the elderly official Ai, then the general Horemheb, progressively dismantled the Atenist program and restored the traditional polytheistic religion. The capital at Akhenaten was abandoned within a few years of Akhenaten's death and was never re-inhabited. Its limestone structures were quarried for building material. Its mud brick residential areas were left to erode. The formal condemnation of Akhenaten, a damnatio memoriae, the Roman term for the deliberate erasure of a person from historical memory, was executed most thoroughly during the reign of Horemheb, approximately 1323 to 1295 BCE, and continued under the early Ramesside pharaohs. Akhenaten's name was removed from king lists. His monuments were demolished. The Talatat blocks from Akhenaten's temples were used as fill in the pylons of Karnak. Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and Ai were collectively referred to in later administrative documents simply as the criminal of Akhenaten, a single condemned individual, nameless, erased from the official record. The discovery of Akhenaten's remains by European archaeologists beginning in the late 18th century, and the decipherment of the site's inscriptions following the progress of Egyptology in the 19th century, recovered from deliberate oblivion, an episode that Egyptian institutional memory had spent considerable effort suppressing. The excavation of Amarna, conducted by the Egypt Exploration Society in multiple campaigns from 1891 onward, with major work by Flinders Petrie, then by T.E. Peat and C. Leonard Woolley, then by John Pendlebury in the 1930s, and continuing today under the direction of Barry Kemp, has produced one of the most extensively studied archaeological sites in Egypt, and the ongoing Amarna project maintains one of the more comprehensive online databases of ancient Egyptian site archaeology currently available. Nefertem, Egyptian Nefertem, meaning beautiful completion, or a tomb is beautiful, was the third member of the Memphite triad, the son of Ptah and Sekhmet, and the divine embodiment of the blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea, that was among the most symbolically charged plants in Egyptian religious culture. His name and his lotus identity connected him to the moment of creation itself. The emergence of the first lotus from the primordial waters was one of the key images of Egyptian cosmogony in the Hermopolitan tradition, and the child sun god who sat within that first lotus was identified in some texts with Nefertem. The blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea, the Egyptian blue water lily, has a specific biological behavior that made it theologically meaningful. It closes at night and opens at dawn, tracking the sun with its blooms in a daily cycle that mirrors the solar journey. Each morning's opening was therefore a miniature recreation of the first sunrise, the first lotus opening on the primordial waters. Nefertem, as the divine lotus, was the solar renewal principle expressed in botanical form. The god whose every daily opening was a fresh act of creation, a new beginning, a repetition of the Zep Tepi in the present moment. Nefertem is depicted as a young man wearing a large blue lotus on his head, sometimes with 2 pendant plumes and 2 necklace counterweights on either side of the flower. He was associated with perfume. The blue lotus has a distinctive and powerful fragrance, and unguents and perfumes derived from lotus flowers were significant products of Egyptian commerce and religious practice. The use of perfume in Egyptian temple ritual, the burning of incense, the anointing of divine statues, the use of floral garlands, was understood as providing sensory pleasure to the divine, maintaining the god's goodwill and presence within the ritual space. Nefertem, as the god of the divine fragrance, presided over this entire dimension of Egyptian cultic life. A small golden mask or head covering found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, K5th 62, Valley of the Kings, discovered by Howard Carter in November 1922, depicts a lotus flower from which the face of the young pharaoh emerges. A reference to Nefertem and to the lotus sunrise theology that identified the pharaoh's rebirth after death with the daily rebirth of the sun from the primordial lotus. The image appears throughout New Kingdom funerary iconography and connects Nefertem to the broader solar resurrection theology that oriented Egyptian mortuary practice. Sokar, Egyptian Sekar, a name of uncertain etymology, was one of the oldest funerary deities in Egypt, attested from the early dynastic period and maintaining continuous cult presence throughout pharaonic history. His domain was the Memphite Necropolis, the great cemetery complex on the desert plateau west of Memphis that included Saqqara and Abu Sir, and he was understood as the divine guardian of this landscape of the dead, the sovereign of what Egyptian texts called the Rose Tour, the mouth of the passages, the labyrinthine underground tunnels and chambers associated with the Duat in the Memphite tradition. Sokar was depicted as a mummiform man with the head of a falcon, a form that aligned him with Horus in his funerary aspect, and was associated with darkness, silence, and the deep stillness of the rock-cut tombs that honeycombed the Memphite plateau. His festival, the Sokar festival, celebrated on the 26th day of the 4th month of the inundation season, was one of the oldest and most extensively documented festivals in the Egyptian calendar, involving the dragging of a special boat, the Henu bark, around the walls of the White Walls, the ancient name for the Memphis Palace complex, and the ritual burial of model granaries. The festival connected Sokar to agricultural fertility, as well as to death. The grain buried in the earth, which would germinate and rise, was an analogue for the dead buried in the rose toe, who would be reborn in the resurrection. Sokar's merger with Ptah, producing Ptah Sokar, and subsequently Ptah Sokar Osiris, brought the ancient Memphite Necropolis deity into the larger theological framework of Osirian resurrection. The triple compound deity, as we discussed in the Ptah section, embodied the complete cycle: creation, Ptah; death and guardianship of the dead, Sokar; and resurrection, Osiris. This compression of the three major existential phases into a single divine identity was one of the characteristic achievements of Egyptian syncretic theology, not a confusion of separate gods, but a deliberate statement that these three phases were aspects of a single continuous divine process. Sokar, Egyptian Sekar, a name of uncertain etymology, was one of the oldest funerary deities in Egypt, attested from the early dynastic period and maintaining continuous cult presence throughout pharaonic history. His domain was the Memphite Necropolis, the great cemetery complex on the desert plateau west of Memphis that included Saqqara and Abu Sir, and he was understood as the divine guardian of this landscape of the dead, the sovereign of what Egyptian texts called the Rose Tower, the mouth of the passages, the labyrinthine underground tunnels and chambers associated with the Duat in the Memphite tradition. Sokar was depicted as a mummiform man with the head of a falcon, a form that aligned him with Horus in his funerary aspect, and was associated with darkness, silence, and the deep stillness of the rock-cut tombs that honeycombed the Memphite plateau. His festival, the Sokar Festival, celebrated on the 26th day of the 4th month of the inundation season, was one of the oldest and most extensively documented festivals in the Egyptian calendar, involving the dragging of a special boat, the Henu bark, around the walls of the White Walls, the ancient name for the Memphis Palace complex, and the ritual burial of model granaries. The festival connected Sokar to agricultural fertility as well as to death. The grain buried in the earth, which would germinate and rise, was an analogue for the dead buried in the rose towel, who would be reborn in the resurrection. Sokar's merger with Ptah, producing Ptah Sokar, and subsequently Ptah Sokar Osiris, brought the ancient Memphite Necropolis deity into the larger theological framework of Osirian resurrection. The triple compound deity, as we discussed in the Ptah section, embodied the complete cycle: creation, Ptah, death and guardianship of the dead, Sokar, and resurrection, Osiris. This compression of the three major existential phases into a single divine identity was one of the characteristic achievements of Egyptian syncretic theology. Not a confusion of separate gods, but a deliberate statement that these three phases were aspects of a single continuous divine process. Egyptian afterlife belief, when examined in its full institutional detail, presents not a vague spiritual realm, but a precisely organized administrative structure, a bureaucracy of the dead governed on principles recognizably analogous to the bureaucracy of the living. This parallel was not accidental. The Egyptians understood the world as governed by Ma'at, the principle of proper order, of things correctly arranged and correctly managed. And they saw no reason why the afterlife should be governed by different principles. If Ma'at required careful administration in the world of the living, it required equally careful administration in the world of the dead. The result was an afterlife system of remarkable specificity, named regions, scheduled procedures, identified officials, documented legal standards, and a clear institutional hierarchy. The primary geography of the Egyptian afterlife was the Duat, the realm of the dead through which Ra's solar bark traveled each night, which we have discussed in earlier episodes. But the Duat was not the only relevant domain. Egyptian texts also describe the field of reeds, Aru, the field of offerings, Hotep, the hall of two truths, the rose toe, and various numbered gates and caverns that the dead soul had to navigate in sequence. The relationship between these different regions varied across texts and periods. The books of the Netherworld present the Dut as a single complex geography encompassing all of these features, while other texts treat them as distinct but connected spaces. But the general structure remained consistent. The soul of the dead person traveled through a series of structured environments, encountered specific divine and semi-divine beings at each stage, performed specific ritual actions and declarations, and eventually arrived at judgment, and, if successful, at a final destination that constituted the Egyptian paradise. The Hall of Two Truths, the Judgment Hall of Osiris, which we touched on in episode 3 in the context of Anubis, deserves full treatment in its own right, as it represents the most institutionally elaborated component of the Egyptian afterlife system. The hall was presided over by Osiris, seated on his throne in full royal and funerary regalia. Flanking him were Isis and Nephthys. The scales of judgment occupied the center of the space. Anubis attended the scales. Thoth stood ready to record. And arranged around the perimeter were the 42 divine assessors. 42 beings, each associated with a specific nome, administrative district, of Egypt, and each responsible for judging the deceased's conduct with respect to a specific category of sin. The Negative Confession. Chapter 125 of the Book of the Dead, also called the Declaration of Innocence, was the central ritual text of the judgment procedure. It consisted of 2 parts. The first addressed to Osiris directly. The second addressed to the 42 assessors individually by name. Each assessor received a specific denial. O wide of stride, who comes from Heliopolis, I have not done evil. O flame embracer, who comes from Kerahar, I have not robbed. O nose, who comes from Hermopolis, I have not been rapacious. The 42 denials covered a comprehensive range of social, economic, religious, and moral transgressions. Theft, violence, dishonesty in commerce, corruption of weights and measures, sexual transgressions, neglect of religious duties, arrogance, and causing harm to children. The specificity of the list is historically informative. The sins enumerated correspond closely to the categories of social harm that appear in Egyptian legal texts and wisdom literature. The didactic compositions like the instructions of Akhenaten, the instructions of Ptah Hotep, and similar texts that guided educated Egyptians in ethical behavior. The judgment of the dead was not evaluated against an abstract moral standard, but against the practical social ethics of Egyptian civilization, the behaviors that made communities function well, that maintained the economic and social fabric, that kept Ma'at operative in everyday life. The afterlife system and the social system shared the same ethical foundations, which is precisely what the concept of Ma'at required. The Book of the Dead itself, more formally, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, or Pert Emheru, was not a single fixed text, but a fluid collection of spells and formulae that individual scribes assembled to commission for specific clients. Different versions included different selections of spells, arranged in different orders, with varying degrees of textual and illustrative elaboration. The most beautifully produced papyri, the Papyrus of Ani, British Museum, EA 10470, 19th Dynasty, approximately 1275 BCE. The Papyrus of Hunefer, British Museum, EA 9901. The Papyrus of Nebseni were luxury objects produced by skilled scribes and illustrators for wealthy clients who could afford detailed illumination alongside the text. More modest versions, a smaller selection of spells, little or no illustration, cheaper papyrus, were produced for clients of more modest means. The underlying theology was available to all. The quality of its material expression varied with economic resources, as it does in most religious traditions. The preservation of the body after death, the physical precondition for the coherent existence of the spiritual components, was managed through a division of custodial responsibility among 4 divine beings known as the sons of Horus: Imseti, Hapi, Dawamutef, and Kebesenuf. These 4 deities, originally understood as the children of Horus in his various mythological relationships, were assigned to protect the 4 internal organs removed during mummification: the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines respectively. Imseti, depicted as a human-headed figure, protected the liver and was associated with the south and with the goddess Isis. Harpi, depicted with the head of a baboon, protected the lungs and was associated with the north and with Nephthys. Duamutef, depicted with the head of a jackal, protected the stomach and was associated with the east and with Neith. Kebesanuf, depicted with the head of a falcon, protected the intestines and was associated with the west and with Serket. The four-directional assignment of the sons of Horus oriented the canopic chest, and by extension the mummified body, within the cosmological space of the tomb, aligning it with the four cardinal points and the four divine protectresses who guarded those directions. Canopic jars, the four containers in which the preserved organs were housed, take their name from the Greek city of Canopus in the Nile Delta, where a local deity was worshipped in the form of a jar with a human head. The classical world's first encounter with this distinctively Egyptian type of object. The jars themselves evolved considerably across Egyptian history. In the Old and Middle Kingdoms, they were typically sealed with flat or domed lids. In the New Kingdom, the lids were modelled in the form of the heads of the four sons of Horus. In the Third Intermediate Period, the organs were sometimes returned to the body after desiccation, with small wax figurines of the sons of Horus placed within the body cavity as symbolic substitutes for the jars. CT scanning of mummies has revealed this variation clearly, allowing researchers to date mummification practices with some precision based on the treatment of the viscera. The destination of the successfully judged soul was the Field of Reeds, Egyptian Aru, a paradise described in Egyptian texts as a perfected version of Egypt itself, a landscape of canals and waterways, of abundant grain fields, of gentle breezes and permanent daylight, where the blessed dead lived in conditions of ease and plenty, without the hardships of earthly existence. The geography of Aru mirrored the geography of the Nile Valley. There were fields to cultivate, boats to sail, temples to attend. The dead who inhabited it were not disembodied spirits, but complete physical presences. Their AHE, their glorified spiritual body, was understood as a real and tangible form that could eat, drink, move, and engage with the environment. The agricultural dimension of Aru was specifically preserved and in some respects elaborated. Chapter 110 of the Book of the Dead, one of the most frequently illustrated chapters in the papyri, depicts the deceased ploughing, sowing, harvesting, and reaping in the Field of Reeds, performing the agricultural work that had structured Egyptian life in the world of the living. The illustration typically shows the deceased, and often their spouse, engaged in this work within a highly schematized landscape of rectangular fields divided by waterways, with tall, heavy-headed grain growing from the earth. This was not a punishment or a labor sentence. It was the good life, the properly ordered existence of a productive human being, transposed into a context where the grain never failed, and the inundation always came and nothing went wrong. The practical concern about who would perform agricultural labor in the afterlife, particularly for elite Egyptians who had not personally farmed in their earthly lives, was addressed through the Shabti or Ushabti system, small mummiform figurines placed in tombs in quantities ranging from a single figure to the royal norm of 365, one for each day of the year, with an additional 36 overseer figures, inscribed with Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead, This chapter directed the Shabti to respond on the deceased's behalf whenever they were called upon to perform agricultural work in the afterlife, to say, "Here I am," and take up the hoe and the seed basket and do the work. The Shabtis were not merely symbolic. They were understood as functional substitutes, magical workers activated by the spell inscribed on their bodies. Wealthy tombs sometimes contained hundreds of Shabtis in multiple materials: faience, wood, stone, bronze, representing an enormous economic investment in afterlife labor provision. The Shabti industry was one of the most economically significant craft productions in ancient Egypt, and examples in virtually every material and quality level survive in collections worldwide. Alongside the field of reeds, Egyptian texts describe a second destination for the blessed dead that reflects an older and in some ways more austere conception of the afterlife. The imperishable stars, the Ikamusek, the circumpolar stars that never set below the horizon and were therefore always visible in the Egyptian sky. These stars, the stars of Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and the other circumpolar constellations visible from Egypt's latitude, moved continuously around the celestial pole without ever disappearing. And this permanent visibility made them the natural symbol of eternal, uninterrupted existence. The pyramid texts, the oldest body of Egyptian funerary literature, emphasize the stellar afterlife more heavily than later texts, which increasingly focus on the solar journey and the field of reeds. The early royal theology of the Old Kingdom imagined the dead pharaoh joining the circumpolar stars, becoming one of the eternal lights of the sky, participating in the celestial order as a cosmic rather than an agricultural being. This stellar conception and the later solar conception were not mutually exclusive in Egyptian thought. The dead king could be among the circumpolar stars and also journey with Ra in the solar bark. But the relative emphasis shifted across time, with solar imagery becoming increasingly dominant from the Middle Kingdom onward, and the stellar imagery becoming more supplementary. The Nut tradition, the understanding of Nut's body as the sky populated with the souls of the dead, as we discussed in episode 2, represents a third way of conceiving the afterlife destination: the blessed dead as stars within Nut's body, traveling with her through the daily cycle, swallowed each morning and released each night, participating in the celestial movement that maintained the order of the cosmos. These three models, the field of reeds, the solar journey, the stellar existence within Nut, coexisted in Egyptian funerary texts without apparent contradiction, because Egyptian theology was not troubled by multiple simultaneous answers to the same question. The afterlife was a large place. There was room for all of them. Serket, Egyptian Serket, meaning she who causes the throat to breathe, was the scorpion goddess, one of the 4 divine protectresses of the canopic chest, and one of the most ancient deities in the Egyptian Pantheon. She is depicted as a woman with a scorpion on her head, its tail curved forward ready to sting, and she was associated with both the danger of the scorpion's venom and its antidote, the same dual mastery of harm and cure that characterized Sekhmet in the medical domain. Serket was specifically invoked for protection against scorpion sting and snake bite, and her priests, like the Wai-Hishbi priests of Sekhmet, functioned as both ritual performers and medical practitioners in this specialized domain. Serket's funerary role extended beyond the canopic chest to the protection of the mummification process and of the deceased's body during its vulnerable transitional period. Gold-covered wooden figures of Serket were found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, positioned at the corners of the canopic shrine in her standard protective posture, arms outstretched, body turned slightly as if watching, her scorpion alert above her head. The quality of the Tutankhamun Serket figures, now among the most iconic objects in the Cairo Egyptian Museum, reflects the importance attached to this divine protection in royal burial equipment. Bes, Egyptian Bes, a name possibly derived from a word meaning to protect, occupies a unique position in Egyptian religious iconography because his appearance is radically unlike that of any other major Egyptian deity, where Egyptian gods are typically depicted in profile, in the austere frontal convention reserved for divine faces only in specific iconic contexts. Bes is shown full face, a dwarf with a lion's mane and ears, a feathered crown, a protruding tongue, and a generally grotesque, energetic appearance that ancient observers associated with apotropaic power, the capacity to frighten away evil through the representation of something even more alarming than the evil itself. Bes was the protector of the household, of pregnant women, of newborn children, and of the marriage bed. He was the divine presence in the domestic spaces where life was most precarious. The birth room, the nursery, the bedroom. Bes figures, small faience or terracotta statuettes, were placed in these spaces as permanent guardians. Images of Bes were tattooed on the thighs of female dancers and musicians, a practice documented in mummies from the Middle Kingdom period and studied in detail by the Egyptologist Anne Austin, whose 2016 analysis of tattooed mummies from Deir el-Medina identified Bes among the motifs. The god's popularity across social classes was exceptional. Bes figures have been recovered from royal palaces, from the modest houses of Deir el-Medina workers, and from virtually every other domestic archaeological context in Egypt, and his cult spread throughout the Greco-Roman world, where his distinctive image appears in sites from Britain to India. Heket, Egyptian Heket, possibly related to the word for frog, was the frog-headed goddess of childbirth and of the final stages of the grain's germination, a pairing that reflects the Egyptian understanding of growth and birth as expressions of the same divine generative force. She was present at the moment of delivery, assisting Noom in the animation of the newly formed individual, holding the ahank to the nostrils of the child and its ka as they came off the divine potter's wheel, and was invoked in protective amulets worn by pregnant women and in spells for safe delivery. The frog's association with birth and fertility in Egyptian thought derived from the enormous numbers of frogs that appeared each year following the Nile flood. The sudden, apparently miraculous emergence of life from the receding waters that mirrored the emergence of the individual from the waters of the womb. Heket's frog-headed form connected her to this annual event and to the primordial creation that it annually reenacted. Her amulets, small faience frog figures, or figures of Heket herself, were among the most common protective objects in Egyptian domestic and funerary contexts, and a number of examples bear the inscription, "I am the resurrection," a phrase that links the birth goddess directly to the Osirian theology of resurrection that she preceded chronologically by many centuries. Thoaris, Greek form of the Egyptian Taweret, meaning the Great One, was the hippopotamus goddess of pregnancy and childbirth, and the paired divine protectress of the household alongside Bes. She is depicted in one of the most visually striking forms in the Egyptian pantheon, a standing female hippopotamus, bipedal, with pendulous human female breasts, the back of a crocodile along her spine, and lion's feet. She typically holds the SH sign of protection, and sometimes a torch. The accumulation of dangerous animals, hippopotamus, crocodile, lion, in a single figure encoded the apotropaic logic of Bes extended to full zoological scale, a deity terrifying enough to drive away anything that might threaten a pregnant woman or a newborn child. The hippopotamus in Egyptian symbolism had a dual identity. The male hippo was associated with Set and with dangerous, uncontrolled force. The animal that could capsize boats, devastate crops, and kill without warning. The female hippo was associated with maternal protection, with the ferocious defense of offspring that is observable in hippopotamus behavior, and that the Egyptians recognized and honored. Thoris was the female hippopotamus elevated to the divine, the protective fury of the mother transformed into a divine guardian of all mothers. Her amulets were among the most commonly worn by pregnant Egyptian women, and her image appears on the beds and headrests of New Kingdom domestic contexts, where her protective presence was desired during the vulnerable hours of sleep and birth. We have arrived at the end of the series. Over 5 episodes, we have moved from the primordial waters of Noon through the self-created Atum, through the architectural first family of Shu, Tefnut, Geb, and Nut, through the central drama of the Osirian cycle, through the broader divine court of everyday life, and finally through the builder gods and the full institutional machinery of the Egyptian afterlife. The Pantheon is assembled. The theological system is complete, or as complete as it ever was, which is to say, comprehensive, internally consistent in its major frameworks, productively contradictory in its details, and designed to accommodate human life in all its dimensions, without requiring that any of those dimensions be sacrificed to the simplifications that strict monotheism would eventually impose. What distinguished Egyptian religion from many of the traditions that succeeded, and in some cases replaced it, was precisely this tolerance for multiplicity. The Egyptians could hold Atum and Amun and Ptah as simultaneously the supreme creator, without requiring that one of these formulations be correct and the others false. They could understand the solar bark's nightly journey, the imperishable stars, and the field of reeds as simultaneously valid descriptions of the afterlife, without reducing them to a single authorized account. They could worship Ra in the morning, and Osiris at a funeral, and Hathor at a feast, and Bes at a birth, and experience these not as conflicting loyalties, but as the appropriate devotion to the aspect of the divine most relevant to the present moment. The divine was large enough to accommodate this. Human life was varied enough to require it. The tradition persisted, with modifications, with syncretisms, with the successive theological revolutions of the New Kingdom, with the Atenist experiment and its suppression, with the Ptolemaic elaborations and the Roman period survival of isolated cults. For longer than any other continuous religious tradition in the historical record, when the last pagan inscription was carved on the walls of the Isis temple at Philae in 394 CE, the tradition that inscription expressed was already older than Christianity is today. The gods did not die quickly. They faded slowly over centuries, as the institutional structures that had sustained them were dismantled, as their temple estates were transferred to new owners, as the knowledge of hieroglyphic writing, the language of the gods, Thoth's gift, the technology through which the divine word had been preserved for 3 millennia, was lost to all but a handful of practitioners, and then to none. The hieroglyphic script was deciphered by Jean-François Champollion in 1822 using the Rosetta Stone, a decree of Ptolemy V inscribed in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek, recovered by Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1799 and subsequently captured by the British, now in the British Museum, EA 24. Champollion's decipherment reopened the 3,000-year archive of Egyptian religious thought to human reading after a silence of approximately 14 centuries. Everything we have discussed in this series, the texts, the rituals, the myths, the careful theological distinctions between one solar aspect and another, the 42 sins of the negative confession, the names of the sons of Horus, the mechanism of the weighing of the heart. All of this was recoverable because someone thought to carve the same decree in 3 scripts, and because someone else, 2 millennia later, had the patience and brilliance to work out what the oldest of those scripts meant. The Nile still flows. The desert is still red at sunset. The pyramids still stand at Giza, oriented with a precision, their sides aligned to the cardinal points within fractions of a degree, that continues to impress engineers who study them. The temple of Karnak is still there, its hypostyle columns still reaching toward the sky, the inscribed names of the gods still visible in the stone. The gods themselves, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Hathor, Thoth, Anubis, Amun, are still present in the texts, in the images, in the objects that fill the museums of Cairo and London and Paris and New York and 100 other cities. They are not worshipped in the way they once were, but they are not gone either. 3,000 years of sustained human attention leaves a mark that outlasts the attention itself. That is the end of the series. The Pantheon is complete. The archive is closed. Sleep